In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about the different perceptions of the self.
Now, Rogers would claim, for example, that to ignore a private experience warps you fundamentally. So, here's the basic outlines of his view of the world. So there's, first of all, you exist within a phenomenological field. Now, phenomenon comes from the Greek word phanesthai. And phanesthai means to shine forth. And so phenomena are those things that shine forth for you. Now, the way to understand that is to imagine that you're reading a book and maybe a passage of it really strikes you as meaningful. Well, then you might say, well, why? There's lots of passages in the book. If someone else was reading the book, it's not obvious that the same passage would strike them. And then you might say, well, is that a consequence of the structure of you as an interpreter of the book? Or is it a consequence of the contents of the book? And the answer to that is you actually can't tell, because the book is neither the thing that's printed nor the reader. The book is the interaction between the reader and the book. And that interaction is actually unique for each person, even though there might be some commonalities across people, because otherwise you wouldn't even be able to talk about a book. Well, regardless, when you're interacting with something, some things announce themselves on your field of consciousness and other things don't. And so the phenomenologist would say, well, some things shine forth for you, while other things don't. It's a little bit like one of Jung's ideas about the development of the self. Jung believed that if you followed things that announced themselves to you as meaningful, that they would take you through a descent to begin with, where you would encounter things you were afraid of or terrified of and disgusted by and wanted to avoid. And then the consequence of that would be that you'd incorporate a lot of new material into your personality. And the consequence of that would be you'd be reborn, roughly speaking, as a stronger person. And then if you just kept doing that all the time for the rest of your life in small and large ways, that you'd become more and more and more fully differentiated and developed. And he would have said that the ultimate potential target of that kind of development was what he described as the self. Now, the self is a multifaceted conceptualization, so that's not all there is to it. But the self, from the Jungian perspective, is who you could be if you could be who you most deeply are. If you didn't shy away from anything, if you accurately encountered and then integrated, even in a Piagetian sense, your experience. Now, that's exactly the same idea that Rogers had. He believed that there's a phenomenal field and it's full of experience. All of your experience manifests itself as the phenomenal field. It's quite interesting, because it means also that other people are part of your phenomenal field, part of your experience. And then that within that field, there's a circumscribed area that he described as the self. Now, that's different than the Jungian self, so it's somewhat terminologically confusing. Rogers' self is more like Freud's ego. But Rogers would define the self as those aspects of the phenomenological field that you call I. I felt like. I've had clients who tended to talk in the third person about their emotions. Or they would say the body. They wouldn't say I. Maybe they're describing cutting themselves. They'd say, well, the body needed to be cut. And what Rogers would say about that was that the person existed in the phenomenological field, and part of that phenomenological field was demarcated by the self, but the self hadn't expanded to incorporate as much of that phenomenological field as it should have. The other concept he had was the concept of the organism. Now, you can think of the self as what you identify with I. And then you can think of the organism as all those things that are unique to you that you might identify with the I. Now, it's tricky, because imagine that you get angry during a fight with someone, argument, and they say, you're angry, and you say, no, I'm not. Well, it's like, what exactly are you doing there? The other person, we're going to assume the other person's right for the sake of this argument. They can clearly see that you're angry, but you're not allowing the organismic manifestation of that motivational state or emotion to be incorporated with those things that you identify with. Rogers would call that incongruence. And he believed that incongruence was roughly equivalent to psychopathology. So that part of your goal was for the organism to respond appropriately to the broader phenomenological field. Now, we can talk about what appropriately means, but we won't do that yet. And then what the self was supposed to do was accurately, symbolically represent organismic responses to the broader phenomenological field. So, now you can see that there are similarities between that concept and, say, Freud's idea of the ego and the id. Because the id was this sort of external thing that was the home of motivational and emotional forces that couldn't be easily integrated into the ego. And partly because the superego said, for example, that they were wrong. And so there is these sets of phenomena, that all of the different clinicians are talking about, but all of them are talking about it starting from different initial presuppositions. And it's like a group of people in a room shining a flashlight on a very complex object. They're all standing in a slightly different position. The complex object is the same thing, but you can only see parts of it. And so you need multiple different ways of looking at things so that you can come up with a cohesive and coherent account of something that's actually beyond your understanding. Because, of course, not only can you not accurately, symbolically represent the phenomenological world, the entire domain of your being, you can't accurately represent even the aspect of that field that's related to the organismic you. There's this part of you on top that you identify with I, roughly speaking, and it's trying to model a model of something very complex. And, of course, that's extraordinarily difficult. Now, why is it doing that? That's the central mystery of consciousness,